Good evening, everyone. I'm Joseph Cole, and it's a pleasure to come and think about your town and come up with ideas. And so, for those of you that saw me, I pretty much had my head down most of the time, dreaming of how we could turn Midtown into something really cool and exciting. Which, you know, when you go there, I was a little surprised myself, but so at least I think we've got a way we can get there. Midtown, if you don't know it, is kind of bounded on the north by Acorena Springs Drive, it swings through. We've got the Blanco River here, we've got Highway 80 to the south that swings into Hopkins. So we've got railroad tracks that bifurcate it, we have power lines that bifurcate it, we've got a lot of flood areas, with a lot of new development, which looks like to me mostly apartments, probably catering to students, but I would guess there's some faculty that probably live up there too. Then west of Interstate 35, you can tell by just looking at the buildings that there are older motels, older apartment buildings, and so I would think that in time, you know, we know pretty much everything gets torn down eventually, and so it looks like that the biggest opportunity is in here, closer to the stadium and the sports facilities, and then perhaps over here where there's less built out. And I realize the reason hasn't been built out is there's a lot of flooding issues and drainage issues there. But it's actually seated really in the center of this and is, I think, a really great opportunity. So the big challenge has been how, if we're talking about creating walkable areas, so we need the bicyclists and the pedestrians as well as every other means of getting around. And the only way to really make that happen is to have streets. And so we really have to focus on streets. And it really looks like a lot of the streets certainly in the older area, that was never the thinking, that, you know, the street is the important way that people get around, because the mentality was always, we're just gonna drive past this, or we're gonna drive to this. And so Thorpe Drive that runs through the middle here really has no buildings kind of facing it, and so I think that's, and then the fact that none of the other properties, with only a few exceptions, have streets that actually go east-west or from that direction. So it's kind of, that's why we were scratching our heads saying, how on earth are we going to make a walkable place where there's no streets? And you've got multiple property owners, and so that was the challenge. And up here we've got fairly new development, and so again we know their obsolescence is much farther out. We probably will not see too much change unless something happens. So what we do is we go and we look at existing property lines, which you can make out the fainter lines, and we try to come up with a system knowing that a certain block size should probably be somewhere between 400 and 600 feet long on the side, and creating multiple ways to get around. So we come up with this kind of irregular pattern that's kind of based on the existing property lines and how to focus that. So here's Thorpe running through the middle here, and so that really does, you know, this western area has the interstate on the side, which acts as a barrier, and then you've got the university and the railroad tracks over on this side. And so really, I think the importance of that center street, fixing it up and making it attractive, will then cause perhaps some other property owners to fix up their properties or perhaps to redevelop as things take place. On the western side, the eastern side, there are multiple property owners, but they all happen to line up right here, and I'm not quite sure why that is. It must have been an old farm, I guess, farmland. And so that looked like a great opportunity that, in fact, most of them have parking lots that face that property line. that, because it's right on a line, that would be a great place to put a bicycle trail so that it's centered, so everybody that lives around here could access that. It would not require demolition of any buildings. It could be done probably with minimal interruption. And then perhaps over time, that trail, just like the old cowboy trails and Indian trails turned into roads, it could too also turn into a real street someday in the future. Perhaps beyond our lifespan, but who knows. So the idea of that also connecting up to the Blanco River, there is discussion of making trails off along this river. It's a logical place to kind of connect up. It comes through the center. Since there seems to be a drainage problem in this area, what if we were able to consolidate all the drainage and flooding and runoff into some type of central system that goes from property to property, so you don't end up with those giant concrete tanks that I've seen around the area, or big, large, fenced-off depressions, and that actually can become a public amenity that people will want to live next to, and also gives you a great place to connect more trails through the neighborhood. And so that's kind of what this is as an exercise. It's not, I wouldn't read it. I read it as kind of a diagram of how to do it, more than a way that this is the only way to do it. But certainly there's multiple ways to make that happen. So, what we do is we say, Jason was talking about the 5-minute walking distance. That's typically what someone would be willing to walk without jumping in their car to go to a destination trip, not just for exercising. And so what we did is, since it's a large area, is kind of try to visualize the entire district as a series of these walkable, sometimes they're called pedestrian sheds, sometimes they're called neighborhoods. But when we look at old developments from before the invention of the automobile, they tend to be about this size, and so that's where it comes from. It has an old tradition. And then thinking again in terms of implementing and using the code, which I believe Brian is going to speak more of shortly. So we took that area, and so of course closer to the university and town on the west side, more intense. Also very intense along the interstate here, but as we get closer to the river, we couldn't help but notice there's some, the river drive there, I was just shocked when I went back there. I felt like it was all of a sudden in the country. And so that should probably remain as kind of a low intensity area. And then that's also good environmentally for the river. And then kind of transition to some kind of in-between intensity to again to act as a transition to the more intense areas. And so here's a diagram showing how you can, basically the green network of the rivers can intrude into the neighborhoods and make just a wonderful place that is all connected. Would be a great place to live and bicycle and walk. So these are the big streets, and pretty much in most cases, with the exception of this one, which we were introducing as a new possible street, are the majority of the existing streets, and so that really shows how it's a tough challenge to get some walkability in Midtown. And so the kind of the second layer of streets that you might want to add to get more walkability, and then as projects redevelop in time, then you can get that finer grain of streets there. So again, thinking, we often say, we have to remind people that planning is a verb. It's really it's like watching a movie. When we do a map, it's just a photograph in time. And so you really kind of have to think of this as a process that will go in time. So just to diagram this out, this is looking, it's right near the Springtown Mall, which is right here on the right side of the screen off the picture. I think this is the Office Depot right here. And so you can see that even Thorpe, there are not continuous sidewalks along there currently. So the street, and I realize there's some topography there from one side to the next, but it really doesn't seem desirable as a street you'd want to walk along or to bicycle on. And so I suppose very rarely does somebody actually walk from perhaps this apartment or this apartment down to the Office Depot or bank. So just kind of to cartoon that a little bit to make it explanatory. So perhaps probably the first thing that could be done is fixing the streets. And so again, trying to make continuous sidewalks that are easy to walk and bike along, trying to slow down the traffic, making it safer. Cars are going very fast through there for really no reason. So then let's say somebody follows this new set of rules. And so now the rules are about facing buildings towards the street. So whereas this project that looks actually pretty nice, in the center, the way the buildings are grouped together here, but you see the parking is ringing it. So the idea with doing a development that's more street-oriented is you actually make a street. So the street would, whether it's private or public, you can think of as a public, you could think of it as a linear parking lot. If it was private, you would still put parking spaces on it, so it still has a use. And again, kind of plant that idea of planting trees or creating shading devices to make that walk nice. And then the buildings face the street, and then the parking is kind of shielded behind. So that's a vacant site at the moment, so it was an easy target for my diagram. And so then over time, since these properties are in smaller pieces, individual property owners could follow the new rules. And so now we're starting to get buildings that is the front of the building facing this new sidewalk that we've put in. And their parking can be towards the back. And some of those buildings might even stay. There's a little what looks like a house, but I think it's an office. And then there are bigger increments, and we did hear from a lot of people who said the affordable housing property that's between Thorpe and the university's recreational stuff looks like a great opportunity. We heard a lot of people say, no, that's a precious thing, let's keep it. So whatever happens there, I hope I think the win-win would be let's build it and keep some affordable housing in there as well. And just to show, and then eventually with time, it really depends on what the market is going to say about this cool new neighborhood that's springing up right next to the university. These buildings could be apartments, they could have some retail on the bottom, some businesses to support the folks that are living here. That's the idea.
Let's get some feedback on some of the ideas that we showed you.
Thank you, Joe.
All right, so Abby talked about Hopkins as a gateway. And she talked about a retrofit that essentially would put on-street parking and cycle tracks and a green street so that when water comes down that hill, it's caught here, it's filtered, it's clean before it gets to the river. And then if we go back, you build a great street, and then development on that street is likely to be more street-oriented. You see the multi-use buildings with storefronts, with arcades, possibly even dining areas. Okay, so let's ask. Would you like to see Hopkins transformed to a multimodal gateway street? Somewhat along the lines of what we just showed. 1 for yes and 2 for no. Okay, 88% of people said yes to that. Remember that number. The next question. Our elected officials remind us, they're keepers of the public treasury. They say nothing is for free. So if you're going to ask them that question, they said ask them this question. Would you like to see Hopkins transformed into a multimodal gateway street if it cost the city $5 million to receive the road from TxDOT and to rebuild the road? And $5 million is just a real ballpark estimate, okay? It would have to go from being a state facility to being a local street, and then there is a cost to that retrofit that we just discussed. 1 for yes and 2 for no. Okay, we only lost 5% on that one. Thought it'd be more. So then we had that from those officials, and then our economic advisor comes and says, this piece, okay? He says, well, it isn't just cost, it's going to be revenue produced. Public investment is often followed by private investment. So then the question transforms. Would you like to see Hopkins transformed into a multimodal gateway street, cost the city $5 million to receive the road from TxDOT and rebuild the road if it could be proven that more than $5 million could be generated through sales tax and property tax increases, which is to say, the road would more than pay for itself? Yes or no? We'll get into the specifics of this when the economist gets up. For now, poll is open. We went from 88 to 83, and now we're up to 89. All right, we convinced somebody. All right, well, Sean's going to make that argument when he gets up here very shortly. It's not about that street, but about placemaking in general. Next question. Are you in favor of creating new centers east of Interstate 35 in areas that are away from the aquifer recharge zones and existing neighborhoods? This is to help my conscience a little, showing all those new streets and showing all those new blocks and showing all those new people. Abby was like, look, we established this with a comprehensive plan. We're clear on this. But planning is a verb. It's an open question. So tell us, yes or no? 91% said yes. Wow. I feel better. We were drawing these things. Oh my God, what are we doing? Thank you. All right. Can you imagine the City Hall complex? Remember that? Those renderings that James Doherty did? Can you imagine the City Hall complex transformed into a walkable mixed-use center that offers more than just government services? So it could stay City Hall, but there could be more there. Housing and cafes and offices potentially. Is this even conceivable? Does this make any sense to you? 1 for yes and 2 for no. 93% said yes. Wow. All right, so that was kind of positive. Now let's talk about how to make this happen. Brian will talk about code and implementation, and then Sean will talk about funding and finance.
Okay, so as we're walking through this process, we talked a lot about master plans, we talked a lot about the idea of the comp plan. You've seen some very specific illustrations here. And so now what we need to do is really get into the nitty-gritty of how do you make this happen? And the implementation side of things is really important. So when we're looking at these ideas and taking the concepts and turning them into reality, we do that through the coding process. And so our main task here is to revise the zoning ordinance and create a unified development ordinance that brings together all of the different parts and pieces that you currently have in place, and then also setting about to clean up what you had, and then also adding new concepts and new ideas that we've talked about with the character-based approach. So looks like they're scrambling around here trying to swap the signal still. In addition to the zoning ordinance, what we're working on is a technical manual. And the technical manual will be full of all of the things that, as it sounds, are technical in nature. So you'll be looking at street section, construction techniques, all of those sorts of things. And we will, you pause for a minute here. The slides are important. Talk amongst yourselves. Do we have a keypad poll? Okay. So I'm just going to wing it here. You missed the benefit of all the great pictures, but we tried to make coding look really sexy in the presentation. So the idea is that we've taken the intensity zones, which are the purple areas. Hey, there we go. All right. Have your presenters night here. Especially one with a really bad memory, like me. Okay. River runs through. All right, so comp plan. Everything's derived from the comprehensive plan. Here we see that map. You've seen it several times. We like to reiterate it because throughout this process, people have asked several times, "What's this all about?" And there's a little comp plan told us to do it. Don't blame us. It's great because you guys put a lot of time and effort into the comprehensive plan, and so we're only focusing on these areas of the purples and the pinks. The areas of stability we took for took them for what they're called, as being stable. We've learned through this process, though, that stable is a relative term here. The neighbors have told us that, and so we're working through that process because we know there's a lot of anxiety, a lot of concern about that, and so that's important to note. So some of those things have to do with comprehensive plan amendments and that process that you guys go through. That's not what we're here specifically to talk about. We share thoughts and ideas about that with you guys throughout this week. But what we're focusing on are the purples and the pinks. So we started by looking at your existing zoning in those areas specifically to see what was on the ground and what was allowed. We started to see that as an interesting concept, that areas of stability, for us, we assumed that it meant just sort of detached single-family residential neighborhoods, and because that's what we hear from a lot of communities around the country when they say, leave us alone, keep us stable. What we learned is stability actually means in the comprehensive plan that the existing zoning that's in place is just going to stay as it is unless something gets changed. So as you saw, we went out and measured and walked around. We did these great synoptic surveys, which are super helpful for us. And it seemed a little bit technical, but in the end, when we talk about setbacks and character districts and all of those kinds of things, we want to make sure that when you guys ask us, why did you do that, we can say, because in these areas you told us you love the most, that we're trying to have more of, it actually is set up like that, and this is the DNA of this place. So we've begun actually writing the new zoning ordinance and revising what you have. So this is our working cover, focusing on what's important here. You know, there's a lot more to it than just that. Now, if there's one thing we heard more than anything else, like Jason mentioned earlier, was about open space, the environmental sensitivity, protecting these elements and components. And I showed you at the opening presentation the idea of civic spaces being included in the zoning ordinance. And right now, you guys often talk about open space, open space, open space, but there's not much talk about the specifics of open space. What does that mean? What does that look like? What is that going to be? And so the zoning ordinance is going to talk about the ideas of squares and plazas and pocket parks and where they go and where that's appropriate. But also, one of the key things is here you see Greenway. That's something we heard a lot about, and that ties right into your Greenway master plan. And so as you guys are asking, how are you incorporating these concepts of sustainability that are important to us as a community into the zoning ordinance? These are some of the ways you're seeing that. So large parks and greenways, and even things like pedestrian alleys, like we saw from the councilman's intervention that happened there, showing the cupola on the top of the civic building there. And we're going to be looking at incorporating the road standards from the Transportation Master Plan. And we've been working with those guys through the week, and we'll start to see, street sections that look like this. And then there's a lot of conversation about what should streets look like. We've had conversations with the citizens, and everybody seems to be in favor of, more walkable, pedestrian-friendly streets. We've had discussions with the developers, and they say, we like these walkable streets because they happen to be skinnier, which is great for us because it costs less to build them. That's really nice. And then we've also heard from the city side, there's some concerns about doing streets that are too skinny. And so what we have to do is strike a balance. And we understand that fire trucks and emergency service vehicles have to be able to get down the street. Otherwise, pedestrian safety, kind of out the window if every other reason you're on the street, you're not safe. So what we need to do is make sure that we balance all of those components, and we need to find a reasonable way to do that. Because also, yes, if the fire truck can fit down the street, but the streets are wide that pedestrians that are there all the time, not just some of the time like the fire truck, aren't safe, and we haven't done much. So we need to work through that together as a community, decide what is appropriate. We heard tons about bicycling. We saw people walk in with rear view mirrors attached to their eyeglasses and spandex and all kinds of things. It was amazing. So you guys have some great cyclists here. So we've got something for them as well, incorporating the cycling components. And as I mentioned before, use is still there. Use is still important. We're not just focused on everything being great and walkable and all of that. Use is a component, and it has its place. We're getting into very specific things like impervious surfaces, and these are actually pages from the new code. We're actually writing the document and even doing graphic design while we're here. We're not just drawing the pretty pictures. So this is a page from the code looking at that, so you'll have those kind of things in there. And then here, as we talked about these different character districts, each of the character districts will be laid out like this, and you'll see the example here, and it's all keyed to the setbacks and the building heights and example pictures. We've actually even added all the shade structures to it because you guys talk about how important shade is here. If you want us to walk, you better shade us. And I found out firsthand because we did a tour and I was walking around and I found myself literally just following the shade. I didn't even care where the sidewalk went, I just followed the shade. I know, that's the crazy thing. It's like, it's not even that hot, I know. Because when we were here for Red in the Streets, we melted. So, at least I did. My Miami friends probably didn't. But, and then we're going to talk about things like how the building meets the street. And so we've been calibrating that and focusing on how that happens. And so we've looked at the local examples. We're looking at things like shop fronts, and again, always kind of calibrating to what it is you guys have going on, not just calibrating the pictures, but the dimensional standards, the metrics that go along with that, looking at houses. And we actually did a great tour of the Miller neighborhood in Austin. If you guys haven't seen that, it's amazing. They've incorporated all the things that you guys have been talking about here in a way that it's not being provided here for you currently. So for those of you who are interested, it's a short drive away. You should check it out. So you can really see what these ideas that you're asking for look like on the ground. Ideas of adding some new types that you normally have here in town, like row houses. But you notice that we're not talking about the row houses that you typically get in the suburbs that are set back behind a bunch of parking, and yes, they happen to be attached, but there's not much to it. Here we're talking about row houses that relate to the street. There's a nice little planting area, the sidewalks, on-street parking, street trees, all of those things, and they fit in nicely, even if there happens to be a detached single-family house right next to them, which there is in this picture, and these are actually very valuable in the community that they're in. And then things like live works where people can live above their shops, and many other types that I'm not going to go through right now. We're looking at signage. There's some really interesting things that we've got to figure out with the signage here. You guys have an amazing asset in this sign maker, this blackout signs, I think it's called, or something, that they make all these really cool artistic signs. Now, granted, those may not be appropriate everywhere on every street, but what you've got is something really unique, because most cities that we go to, their key sign maker in town who makes 90% of the signs is like, signs, etc., hurry up, signs in an hour. So you guys have something really cool here. And so we're trying to also figure out what to do with things like this, because this does not easily fit into some sort of sign metrics. And what are the standards for this green guy? And so, on the other hand, would we want to code that out? I don't think so. I think that's really cool and appropriate in a certain place. It's like your little mini version of South Congress in Austin. It's called South Congress. And so, again, calibrating everything we do, even for the unusual and bizarre. I mentioned the technical manual, and so here's the beginning of the technical manual, and the technical manual has in it technical things. And so here we're looking at reference manuals and examples of wall materials and all those kind of things that we found in that document. And then, how does this all work? What's the big idea of the zoning concept here? Because it's not that simple. We had to make sure that the zoning is in keeping with the comprehensive plan, as I've said 5 times now. And to do that, we had to come up with some really sophisticated strategies. So here you're looking at, here's the midtown, here's the triangle, here's your downtown. These are intensity zones. And so we have a few different tracks. The idea is to first have what we call the character-based zone district. So the intensity zone would be circumscribed by the character-based zone district. And within that, the rules of the code apply. And so you say, I go and I look and I find my setbacks, my building heights, my block perimeters, all of the things that make these great places like we're showing you guys have asked for. So that's one concept. On the other hand, what we want to do too is have a pre-approved regulating plan. And so that's what that looks like. So these plans that we've drawn out here, they may be refined back in the office, but the idea is that it's set up for those plans to be pre-approved. That's the concept. So if you build this plan, you can go ahead and get your building permit tomorrow, because these have gone through a process. They've been vested. They'll have to be approved, just like the rest of the code. But you can also, if you don't want to do that and have another idea of how to deal with your property, you can simply just do the character-based zone district. And that means you can make your own plan following the rules. The rules are the same. We use the rules to draw these plans, But it gives that flexibility, also gives some speed of the process. And so everybody knows what to expect. Everybody's gone through the process with these plans, with these regulating plans. The property owners, we've worked with the property lines to make it easy to do. It's really created a very, very proactive approach to zoning. And then the last thing we'll do is actually take the major roads from this, the highest level roads from each of these regulating plans, and those roads will be added to your future roads map. So right now you have sort of, arterials, collectors, primary, secondary arterials are some pretty high level, but mostly focusing on these really big roads, and that's fine where, elsewhere. But what we've done here is sort of zoomed in one level more in the intensity zones to make sure that at least the primary structure of the street network is intact, and then people who want to take the approach of doing their own plan have something, a framework to begin with, and they can start to fill in the blocks within here. Each of these, you can sort of see it overlaid. They can do whatever they want as long as these roads are in place. And so that's sort of the big picture zoning concept. And the key is then, as I said before, to figure out how all of this, the private frontage and the public frontage and the thoroughfare, all work together to create great places of character that are of this place. This is not of this place. This place is really cool and really amazing. It makes a great point. But what we have to do is make sure that the words and the numbers in our code give you something that is authentic of St. Marcos. Now we're going to